athletic excellence at the highest level has given Dr. Wills plenty of first-hand experience of how sport can form us and transform us. But as a philosopher with expertise in virtue theory, moral psychology, and character formation, Dr. Little is also in a unique position to interpret her own experiences as an athlete. As someone who has spent many hours thinking, reading, and writing about the nature of virtue and vice, the inner life, and the role of emotions in forming a virtuous character, she has the theoretical knowledge, concepts, and vocabulary to be able to interpret her experiences as an elite athlete and extract lessons for the benefit of others. Tonight, Dr. Little will tell us about the ways in which the pursuit of athletic excellence can sometimes be in competition with our pursuit of personal excellence. The title of her lecture is Performance Enhancing Vices in Sport. Before I hand things over to Dr. Little, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the sponsors of this event: the Cultural Affairs Committee, the Dean of Arts and Humanities, the Department of Kinesiology, the Department of Philosophy, the Character Forward Grant, and Athletics. It's through their generous support that we're able to gather here this evening. Now please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Little.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm a philosopher, and there are two things you should know about philosophers. The first is we love definitions. You're going to hear a lot of definitions. And the second one is we ask a lot of questions. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer for me. So try to direct it. Oh no. Maybe I'll just figure it out. Okay. So first, what is moral character? Anything that comes to mind. What is a virtue? What is a vice? Anything that comes to mind. You may go for it. Just shout out.
Excellence.
Excellence. Good. Arte, virtue, arte, excellence. Good. What else comes to mind when you hear about character, moral character? Anything else? Do you think of any bad traits of character?
Selfishness.
Selfishness. Good.
Vicious.
What was that? Vicious. Good. Pride, envy, right? All these kinds of qualities. Okay. Why does moral character matter at a place like Hope? Anything you can think of. Why does it matter at Hope? What is Hope about?
We're Christian.
Yeah, you're a Christian college. Good. So character matters here. Good, especially. And why is that? Can you fill in?
I know the standards set by higher power.
Yeah, good. Higher standard, right? The person of Christ. Good. Yep, okay, and then how have sports formed your character in ways? So, any of you who participated in sports, how have they formed you positively? Good. Work ethic? What else?
Teamwork.
Humor?
Teamwork.
Oh, teamwork. Yeah, good. Yep, what else?
Leadership.
Yep, good. Leadership. Okay, and then another question, how has it formed you for ill? Yeah, maybe really competitive in bad ways. Yeah, what else?
Right.
Pride. Good. Comparison. Good. Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so talk objectives. I'm going to provide a framework for assessing the connection between sports and character. I'll introduce what performance enhancing vices are, and then I'll take your questions. And you can ask about anything that can be about the topics that we are talking about here, but anything about virtue, vice, and sports is fair game. Okay, so the connection between sports and character. I'm going to start with a story. Plato's Republic, there's a story called Ring of Gyges. Does anyone know the Ring of Gyges story? Okay, so in the Ring of Gyges, what happens is there's this shepherd, and he seems like a good guy. He's always doing his work, right? And then he discovers a ring, and the ring makes him invisible. And so what does he do? He kills the king, and he takes his wife, and then he becomes the ruler of all the land. So he seemed like a good guy, but then suddenly he becomes invisible to others and is invulnerable, right? actions or because they're desirable, but because they're afraid of getting caught doing bad actions. So when people are watching, Gaius follows the laws, and when he's invisible, he's free from social contract, and so he just does whatever he wants. So this is a good story, right? Because whether or not it's true that no one loves the good, it's interesting to see how people act when they think that no one is watching. You can develop a clear sense of who they are and what they think is important. So something to reflect on for yourself. Are you the same person in your dorm room when your roommate's there versus when they're not? If a camera were to follow you around every day, would you live exactly the same way, or would you live a little bit differently, right? So what are things that you like to keep hidden from view, and what do they communicate about your character? And I'm starting with the story. I'm asking these questions for two reasons. The first is to clarify what having a good character is, right? So having a good character is not social performance. It's not like Gaius, where you live above reproach when people are watching and then do whatever you want when no one is, right? A good character is loving the right things. It's having well-ordered habits of attention. A good character means acting above reproach with consistency, regardless of whether anyone's watching. And second, I raise these questions because a Gaius type scenario recently occurred in my sport, which is long distance running. There's a bad action, the person thought that it wasn't being observed, and then it was exposed, and we learned some things about vices in the sport. So here we go. Last autumn, there was a fall from grace in my sport, long distance running. A runner who, by all accounts, is outstanding. She's among the best. She was caught in a Wikipedia scandal. And it was discovered she was continually adding what the article called fluffery, a word we don't use nearly enough, high praises to her own Wikipedia page while deleting the accolades from her competitors' pages. She wrote that she was the greatest distance runner of all time while deleting accomplishments from her competitors' pages. So according to Canadian Running, it was discovered that she was the source of these changes by a fact checker who realized that the Wikipedia tampering was not occurring while she was racing. And you're thinking, oh, was she doing a 5K or something that's only 15, 16 minutes? No, she was doing a 6-day race, trying to run the fastest you could cover, the furthest you could go in 6 days. And in that 6-day period, there was no editing. So they realized it was suspicious, and then they traced the IP address to her, and she and her husband were forced to invest. So this is surprising to the running world to some extent, that an incredible athlete cared that much about reputation protection that she was committed to Wikipedia editing. But I only say it was surprising to some extent because this is a very clear instance of envy, and envy is quite typical in sports. Envy is the vice of unhappy self-assertion. It's feeling bitter when others have it better. Instead of happily perceiving the successes of others, envy perceives another's good as its own loss, and it's motivated to correct the gap between the other and oneself, however possible. This could be through improving oneself, but it can also be through malicious means, such as by impeding another's successes or explaining away that success so it ceases to be an imbalance. And that was, in effect, what the athlete was doing, right? She's correcting a discrepancy, she's increasing her own accolades and decreasing the other accolades by whatever means she could. So it was an act of unhappy self-assertion. What was also interesting about the scandal was not just that an athlete had done a bad thing, it was also some of the conversations that occurred in the wake of the situation. So friends at the elite and professional level, as well as dedicated novices, made comments to the effect of, I wonder if I would have done that, or something similar too. They related to the desperation the athlete felt. They'd experienced the same desperation to varying degrees. This runner was caught. She probably never imagined she would be, that they could trace the editing to her computer, but competing from a place of envy, unhappy self-assertion is exceedingly common. It's often what we mean by being a competitive person. I'm often asked this question, are you a competitive person? And I think they think it's an interesting question because I'm an ethicist and also a competitor. Are you a competitive person, right? And when I ask them to clarify what they mean when they ask me that question, they'll say something to the effect of, are you undone by a loss? Like, do you have to win? Are you desperate to win? Right? And strictly speaking, these things are not competition. Competition is a neutral term. It just means to strive together, right? Envy is what they're describing. They're this sort of unhappy self-description. And be so entwined in our cultural imagination of what competition is that we describe competition as such. So why does character matter in sports? For starters, because you don't have to look very far to find instances of vice and bad behavior in sports. It's everywhere, and considering athletics is a formative space, we play sports in part to be changed physically, in our characters, our discipline, and our emotions. We need to pay attention to the patterns of bad action present in the sport. They inform how we show up, how we perform, and also how we live our lives outside of the track, the court, or the pitch. Right? Sports shape us in ways that inform how we act outside of the sport as parents, friends, and citizens. So briefly, character matters for at least 3 kinds of reasons. Character matters outside of sports, and sports form our character. Character is required to maintain the integrity of the competition, and character is relevant to how we perform. So briefly, character matters outside of sports, and sports form our character. We change through sports. If we care about the kinds of people we are in general, it's important to examine whether we're being formed constructively, and that's not always a given, right? If you ask parents why do they put little Johnny in Little League, they'll say something to the effect of, oh, he's going to grow in discipline, right? But, if he's not acting disciplined in that space, or if he's being imprudent, or if his emotions are fickle, then he's practicing being the kind of person that you don't want him to be outside of sports. You're not just necessarily going to develop the right things because you are in practice. Examples that in certain sports, if unchecked, you might be pressed to perform outsized and unfitting anger. Because this is a performance asset in certain spaces. So if you've ever watched professional hockey, or even football in some cases, right, there's this kind of bravado and outsized anger, like act with immediacy on the other person. And that makes you good at football and it makes you good at hockey. But it also makes you maybe not the best friend if you were to act on those inclinations outside of the arena. And I should say the formative work that athletics offers is not just while we play sports. If you're sports fans, we have a dedicated commitment to fandom. So we're watching and discussing sports. This is a practice that can also shape us in certain ways. If our fandom is characterized by gossip, we're speaking in ways that are beyond the bounds of decorum, gossiping about trivial features of a player's life. This is a practice of being uncharitable. Sometimes sports fans can use athletes as a means to withdraw from more substantial cares, right? If you find yourself returning to the game scores, but then ignoring the people in your life, right? That is a way of practicing vice as well. If you have questions about the particulars of the formative process, how to use sports as a laboratory for virtue, certainly ask me that during the Q&A. Okay, second, character is required to maintain the integrity of the game. So in the year 2000, American sprinter and long jumper Marion Jones, she won 3 gold and 2 bronze medals in the Sydney Olympic Games. At her peak, she was among the greatest athletes on the planet. However, suspicions arose when her husband, a shot putter, tested positive for steroids. 7 years later, she admitted to having done the same. This was a sad day for Jones fans and supporters who were disappointed and made to feel naive. Moving forward, it's unlikely that they will experience the same uncritical wonder or delight in encountering an excellent athlete. I think the same could be said of the marathoning world. Actually, today, the IAU announced this formal ban on the world record holder in the marathon for women, which is so disappointing. And how do you look at a marathon that is exceptional without any kind of doubt? Like it changes the way that the fans view the sport. But also, in these cases in which you have an athlete cheating, the events are fixed in favor of those athletes, and the terms of their success in the sport are subverted. So one player's bad actions undermine the terms of the sport for everyone, and the athletes can never get those moments back. So a reason for the integral connection between athletics and character is that a high degree of integrity is required to maintain the terms of the sport. When vices abound, the game itself ceases to be fair, and the athlete's dignity is no longer on display. Dignity on display is what the sport is all about, right? It's called the spirit of sport. Okay, the third, character is relevant to how we perform. So last year I watched the Super Bowl, and kind of low football literacy, but I do know that Kansas City won. And in the few minutes that I stood out. The televised broadcast detailed the actions on the field in terms of strategy, the yards gained, and ball movement, but it also praised the players' virtues, their patience, their perseverance, their courage, the excellences of character that supported their ability to play well. And this is because character matters even for performance reasons. The same thing happens in marathons. A couple of years ago, New York City Marathon, Cheryl O'Kady and Evan Stribet were in the headlines, and their victories were attributed respectively to discipline and patience. I have 3 caveats about this feature of sport. First, there are plenty of better reasons to care about character than athletic performance. For example, a life consisting of virtue is on balance a higher or more beautiful one than one that results in the ability to self-govern better, to contribute more meaningfully as community members, to honor God, or to perform whatever other guiding objective is the principal goal for your life. But if you're concerned with character for no other reason, you should know that sports are not morally neutral. And there are many cases in which virtues can support performance. So think about diligence of the football player who shows up daily and puts in meaningful work, not avoiding drudgery. Think about perseverance in the distance runner. Distance running is remaining on task, right? And so that is pretty central as a governing virtue. Consider patience in the tennis player who cannot swing too early, or the conscientiousness of the gymnast who has hit marks perfectly to perform well. The second caveat is this: it would be naive to think that character is all that matters in sports. Relevant variables also include physical training, body size, strength, and good fortune. But character is certainly part of the equation. All other variables held constant. A courageous football player will outperform one absent the trait. This is because he'll experience a suitable fear of risk, which is relevant to successfully pressing the ball downfield. A patient curler will release a stone across the ice at the right moment rather than too soon. The persevering runner will be better positioned to endure than the irresolute runner. So the point is, virtues impact how we occupy the sport. And the third caveat is this: the same is true for vices, and that's all we're going to say about that, because we're going to focus on that in the third part of the talk. Okay. So definitions, performance-enhancing virtues. We start with, these would be character traits that support both success in the sport and in your life, but that make someone a more excellent neighbor or friend. And we don't pay enough attention to these. What's really interesting about sports, if you talk to a sports person, someone who's engaged in sports on a regular basis, they will be crazy about the particulars of their practice, right? They'll talk about their carbon-plated shoes, they'll talk about their moisture-wicking clothes, they'll talk about whatever nutrition is going to support their performance. It'll be really measured, and then they'll throw up their hands when it comes to character. And whether or not you have resilience, whether or not you have courage, these things are going to have a much bigger impact than whether your clothes are performance-wicking. And so it's very odd to me that we never talk about these things. But performance-enhancing virtues, and then performance-enhancing vices. So performance-enhancing vices, character traits that support success in the sport, but also detract from the life that makes someone a worse neighbor or friend. And there are some examples. So resilience, joy, humor, courage, perseverance, and patience. So first, I'm going to talk briefly about the virtues. In early 2016, I broke an navicular bone in my foot 3 weeks out from the Trail World Championships. Do you know what the navicular is? Anybody know what a navicular is? Okay. If you're a runner, you may know what it is. Runners often know the bones for all the wrong reasons, and it's that we break them, and then, so we know what they are. But navicular is this low vascular bone at the top of your foot. If you break it, you often require surgery, and it's a whole mess. So I broke mine through a combination of an imbalance that had resulted in my stride and by running too many miles on hard surfaces. Having had little experience in breaking bones, I did not detect a growing pain that should have been cause for alarm, so I caught the injury after it was too late to recuperate after a few days of rest. The body is resilient and given the space to recover, but I didn't give it that space. This was a pitiable occurrence. It was so close to the Trail World Championships, and I was embarrassed to report my withdrawal from the team. I borrowed my sorrows in physical therapy appointments, where I went through the arduous process of rebuilding my body back to strength. If you've ever been to a physical therapist, you know what I mean by arduous. The difficulty is not in guarantees or impressive feats. It's subjecting oneself to seemingly trivial movements and trusting that they matter. At physical therapy appointments, And this was true. It took about a full year, but I eventually returned to full form. In my year of return from injury, I learned about resilience, the virtue of recovery. I learned that small exercises make a big difference and that bouncing back is a considered choice. I learned that recovery, like all forms of training, is a hopeful act. This is unsurprising since philosopher Nancy Snow writes about resilience as intimate connection to hope. Substantial hopes provide us with mental resolve, help us not to lose heart, and they enable us to maintain effective agency in the face of fluctuations in evidence. Maintaining agency is important. It means we continue to choose and act in light of the possibility of renewal, even if we lack visible evidence of progress. In my injury recovery, I also learned that patience, we're speakers, not slippers. If I could just stay patient, actively patient, the kind of patience that would diligently perform the exercises I was prescribed by my doctor, I might become the athlete that I was before the injury. I might even become better because I would be more adaptable within the process of training and within competitions. There are many virtues that support performance. One example is joy. Thompson Aquinas defines joy as an act or a consequence of love. It's a kind of buoyancy or equanimity in the face of discomfort or aligning with one's good purpose. Sometimes joy is like commonly just referred to as happiness or pleasure or something like that. It's not the same. It's not like a happy feeling. There's a kind of connection or tether to one's purpose that keeps you buoyed, right? So if you think about a buoy on a lake, you can push it down, it's going to pop back up, and that's kind of what joy does for you. It makes you more despair resistant. Another example is humor. So when I thought it was like humor before. Kierkegaard describes a kind of lightness and levity when confronting our limitations and incongruities. This virtue can make the athlete despair resistant too, because when things go awry, they can be setbacks with levity. They're not bothered by their failures. Additional examples are courage, perseverance, and patience. So I gave you some examples there: resilience, joy, humor, courage, perseverance, and patience. And the set of virtues is of course going to depend on what sport, right? Because different kinds of sports are going to support different virtues. Here's another example of resilience. This is Bethany Hamilton, same video story. Yeah, attacked by a shark, right? And then ended up continuing to compete as a surfer. Very resilient. Okay, so then performance enhancing vices. Coming back to these. Okay, so performance enhancing vices, we said these are insidious. They're very difficult to root out. And this is for two reasons. So the first reason, cultural reasons. We praise vice often. We enjoy the spectacle of it. Again, remember earlier I said that fandom can be vicious or it can be virtuous, right? You can support virtue or vice. We tend to celebrate pride, right? In when we're observing someone, there's a kind of like culture of appreciation of vice. Often we're inclined to index our moral actions to our context. There's a philosopher, Eric Schmidt-Gable, and he calls this moral mediocrity. So we tend to cheat, lie, and act in ways that are no better or worse than the people around us. For sports, that means that NBA performance, that is, it's not academically linked to competitive outcomes, then entering athletes are likely to resign to that norm. Remember I said envy is entwined in our sense of what competition even is. Additionally, these vices are difficult to root out because most of the incentives of athletics are in terms of performance. If you think about the collegiate scene, where coaches' contracts are often structured in terms of conference points or maybe national meets, athletic scholarships, ability to make travel rosters, and now incentives that are built into the NIL, name, image, and likeness, make it difficult to prioritize character, being a good person comes at the cost of competing at one's best. So think also of professional athletes. These are difficult performance contingent careers. Runners in particular, runners are referred to as the starving artists of professional athletes because the contracts are so small, even for Olympians. So you need to compete well, sometimes from a place of financial necessity, and sometimes doing so can have character costs. So traits such as envy, pride, or intemperance are good making features of my sport. In submitting at myself to the objectives of that sport, I might put on the kinds of traits that support that performance. And so some examples: envy, attrition, pride, selfishness, intemperance, and unrighteous anger we're going to look at too. So first, pride. If If you spend too much time around sports, you will experience the vice of pride in sports. It's an inordinate desire for one's own excellence or an inflated sense of self. Likely, you've experienced pride so much in sports that you'll fail to notice it anymore. Sports, in broad strokes, has a culture of bragging and self-aggrandizement. Sometimes it's called marketing. Other times, pride hides in plain sight as self-belief. It sometimes has the sporting social media seems like a bunch of people shouting their achievements past each other, bragging in direct or subtle ways. And admittedly, this is probably part of what we enjoy about sports, the self-congratulatory embraciness of it all. It's entertaining. And what I want to say about pride is that in some cases, I think that it would be performance enhancing, and others it would not. So pride commits two errors. The first is an epistemic or knowledge error, so you think you're capable of more things than you actually are. And then the error of valuing is you think you're more important than you actually are, or more important than other people. And the epistemic error, I don't think is going to be valuable in a performance setting, right? So imagine you think that you are faster than you actually are. You enter a race and you try to run the pace that you think you can do, right? Because you're so proud. You're going to crash and hit a wall, right? Or maybe you try to, the basketball court and you overestimate your capacity. You think you can make it down the court, and then you get stuck, right? So I think part of being a good athlete is having a really fine-grained sense of what your capabilities really are. So I don't think pride as like having a firm sense of what you're capable of is the thing that's going to be an issue. But the other part, the overvaluing, putting yourself first, putting yourself on a platform, I think that is going to be performance enhancing. And the reason is if you have this kind of superiority complex about yourself, you're going to be motivated to want to win, right? Pride's greatest secret is it's always under threat. You have to prove that you're the best. If you have to prove that you're the best, that's going to enhance your performance. Okay, to be clear, I don't think you have to be proud as a sports person to be successful either. I think there are alternatives. One is Thomas Aquinas has this concept called magnanimity. It's being very sold and it's striving for great feats that you are indeed capable of. There are ways to compete well between character, but I do think it's obvious if you've spent much time around sports that pride is something that certainly has infected this space, these feelings of grandeur. Okay, and then second, intransigence. If anyone's read Into Thin Air, has anyone read that book? Oh my goodness, it's so good. It's about the people who climb Mount Everest and kind of like the foibles that they get into doing that. So, intransigence, tagline, never quit, except when you definitely should. So during the 2 months of designated climbing season at Mount Everest, medical and rescue operations were getting performed up to 25 rescues per day. Conditions change, the weather turns, but the climbers often fail to relent. They continue at the cost of their own safety, and they imperil those who will try to help them, should they be unable to descend under their own power. Having a mindset of completing one's objectives, whatever the cost, could indeed cost everything in that setting. And this is troubling because the never quit mindset is often what makes them successful in the first place as alpinists, right? That they're willing to push further. But if they push too far, right, it comes at the cost of their lives. So this never surrender mindset is called intransigence, right? If you wrote the word down for the intrans, unwillingness to turn, or pertinacity, it's the vice of excess with respect to remaining in place, and it occurs when someone perseveres in outsized ways or toward bad ends. Intransigence is a good word for this vice because it captures not turning or refusal to abandon, which we see in the case of the ambitious climbers on Mount Everest. We also see it in endurance athletes competing through injuries or committing to training in ways that crowd out earlier commitments in our lives. We see it in basketball players playing through illness. I think of Michael Jordan's flu game in the 1997 NBA Finals. And we see it in CrossFit performers who push themselves to the point of exertional rhabdomyolysis and other adverse outcomes instead of retreat from events. And I just learned about the rope pulling that can sometimes be intransigent, so something to think about. It's not surprising that professional sports people sometimes decide to press through injuries or illness. Social and financial incentives might push them to do so. But this vice vice is present beyond the professional rank. So amateur endurance athletes are bullheaded too. They run through fractures and bind themselves to beats while passing when it makes sense to do so. They run street, they commit to daily miles, sometimes despite higher allegiances needing their attention. And they ascribe to the motto of death before DNF, death before did not finish. Endurance athletes are often recalcitrant. We can see why intransigence might be an asset in sports, at least in the short term. An intransigent runner will reach more finish lines, certainly more finish lines than an irresolute runner will. The intransigent sports person might see more playing time, they might persist in practicing a drill until they get it right, but intransigence is a vice. It's at odds with a flourishing life because it means we're willing to overstep our limits. Our physical limits, but also our cultural limits, or the people in our lives to whom we have a higher allegiance, right? So if you're stepping on your family in order to go practice your sport or something like that, then there are questions to ask there. Competing at all costs is not admirable. Not all finish lines are admirable. Okay, earlier we also said envy, right? The vice of feeling bitter when others have it better, or unhappy self-assertion is common in sport. We saw it in the Wikipedia situation, and this is also likely to be a performance enhancing vice. His feelings of comparative inadequacy are highly motivating. Envy can drive a person to do all the little things in practice and fight hard in the game so no one else can win. It can make one's competitor out to be a foe, and it can transform loss into a terrifying and loathsome thing. All other variables constantly envious athlete will be hard to beat, right? Still, not a quality you want in a friend. I like to think of envy as related to death, or as a kind of death, right? Because envy can't lose, right? It either wins, or it has to explain away or take away the victory of the other person through Wikipedia and or otherwise. Okay. Can anyone tell me who they are? Do they have a conflict between them? What happened? Can you just shout it?
Ranch.
What's that?
A ranch.
Yeah, so now there's an expression, recapping the competition, that came from this scenario. Yeah, so this is another example of envy, right? Often rivalries are described as a kind of envy. If you're against someone who is similarly positioned to you and you want to outperform them in not great ways. These two guys, Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen, does anybody want to describe their relationship? Was it amiable and sunshine? Yeah, it was not good. Yeah, I was recently reading an interview with Scottie Pippen, and he was asked about Michael Jordan, and he said, effectively, Michael Jordan is not a good basketball player. He was explaining it away. And there are lots of things you can say about Michael Jordan. You can say, oh, you know, not a great character or something like that. But saying he's not a good basketball player is factually untrue. So that would be an example of envy. And so a question to ask, right? Ultimately, it comes down to an empirical question. Does envy make someone a better performer than someone absent of that question? And in the Michael Jordan Scottie Pippen scenario, it's an interesting counterfactual, right? Like, what if they got along really well? Would they have played at the level that they were able to, perform at such a high level, not liking each other? And so, yeah, that's what it comes down to. But there are so many instances of these kind of vicious rivalries, and it certainly seems like, at the very least, it's not improving their performances. So why should we care about the presence of these traits, these performance-enhancing vices in sports? We should care because sports form us for good or for ill. It's a big reason why we play sports in the first place, to be transformed by daily practices. Some of the transformation is physical, developing our aerobic capacity or strength, but some of it involves our character. Sports provide practice and how to relate to one another while we strive to accomplish great feats. It shapes our habits of attention and our emotional responses. It forms with who we spend our time. Considering character consists of our dispositions, our patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, we might be especially attentive to formative spaces that we would eagerly enter. So my call to action on these grounds is just to think about the way in which you're being formed. Think about what you're willing to compromise for the sake of being better at sport. And that's all I have for you. So I'm happy to take your questions.
presentation. I was wondering, is there, so I'm thinking about a recent interview. It was recently like a podcast between LeBron James and Jamie Wood, podcast, and they were talking about how there was sort of this frank conversation. I'm trying to get a question, I'm sorry, but he said something like they could have knowingly talked together about how they really needed to sacrifice things like time with loved ones and these kinds of things. That they were aware of this and that it needed to happen. And I just wondered, and it seemed like they just, there was this sort of recognition of ethics that had reached this level. Yeah, of course. And I just wondered if my question is whether we would call it, so if LeBron sacrifices time with loved ones, and if he succeeds, sometimes we call it resilience, right? And if he doesn't succeed, sometimes we call it intransigence, right? And I'm just wondering how do you respond to sort of the question of whether there's some moral luck involved, in which, whether we call it virtue or whether we call it vice in that case.
Yeah, I think that is a really great question. I think moral luck is a significant part of it. Yeah, I think of this in terms of, right, so a running specific example is before marathons, people often call their shots, right? And they'll say, like, I'm going to run the American record. And when they do it, they're a hero. And when they don't do it, they're proud and how dare they say that, right? And it could be the case that they are perfectly capable and they know their limitations and their strengths, and but just, it was a bad weather day or something like that. Any number of factors can intrude upon it such that, they weren't able to perform. And so one answer to that is saying, like, virtues are about, they're longitudinal. It's about the course of one's life, assessed backwards. But when you're assessing singular actions, considerations of luck often intrude upon those cases of how to judge it. I also think sometimes I wonder whether a certain amount of failure is part of learning devices, right? And so in the case of, like, say you're trying to find your limits as an athlete, well, the only way you're going to find them is by hitting a wall sometimes, and so I think that's part of the process. The other thing that your question reminded me of, just kind of how you introduced the question, was like also the language that we're using to describe these things. I was thinking about how one thing that I noticed when I was running professionally among other professional athletes was that the words that were used to describe them by their peers were things like dedicated, perseverant, and conscientious. And their families used different words. They would use obsessed and inflexible. Like, they would use a different. So it's not just a matter of judging them from the future, right? Like figuring out, did it work out in your favor? It's also, are you within the sport or are you outside of the sport? Like, there are different frameworks for assessing what actually is going on in these situations.
So how does someone distinguish then the difference between virtue and vice in those sorts of scenarios? Or is it not really possible?
So it is possible. Yeah, I'm certainly not a fatalist about being able to assess virtue and vice. You're supposed to assess virtue and vice, like, in the broad Aristotelian tradition with respect to your nature. So what is the influence of your nature? And sometimes I think that, like, in the short term, we get that wrong. Like, we are trying to, like, there are things that I thought that I was doing excellently in my 20s that I now look back on and I realize that I was not right about it. And so saying that I got it wrong, or my advantage was not right, or having a sort of limited perspective on yourself, or someone else observing and missing, what is actually the excellence of your character, like having these sort of epistemic limitations, being things adequately doesn't mean that there's no right or wrong, right? There is such a thing that it means to flourish as a person. It just means like it takes a lot of practice and life lived to be able to evaluate yourself with clear eyes.
That's very interesting. I have a question about performance enhancing virtues. So, as I understand what it is for a trait to be a virtue, it seems like it would have to dispose you toward right action, not just in this or that case, but in a sufficiently wide number of cases. And a natural way of thinking about that is, or something that strikes me as sort of intuitively plausible, is that these traits that we call performance enhancing virtues or use virtue names for might not seem to be genuine virtues if they only apply in sports, right? So I wonder if you agree with that, and then if you do, I wonder if, like, how often do you think that the term we use a virtue name for in sports talk really is the genuine virtue? Like, just, I don't know, off the cuff, seems kind of plausible to me that, like, the perseverant athlete, the disposition we're tracking there, really is one that, like, makes you more perseverant in other areas of your life, really is genuine perseverance. Whereas, like, patience, for instance, I feel like Tom Brady was an extremely patient quarterback, in as much as he, like, was really good at, like, waiting to throw the ball or even look down his receivers when they'd taken the right number of steps. At the risk of speculating about the moral character or someone I don't know, I don't get the sense that he was like a patient dad or a former husband, or, you know, so I wonder how often you think what we call virtues really genuine are.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Okay, so there are two things I'll say about that. First of all, I don't think this is like a sports-specific thing. Oftentimes I'm praising the honesty of my 3-year-old, who definitely does not have the robust virtue of honesty. Okay, and then the second part, so if someone is exhibiting something that is virtue tracking in a sport, so something that's true of virtues is they're not just in a narrow situation, it is cross-situational, so across the course of your life. So say you have virtue of honesty, right? Well, that doesn't mean like you're honest with your friends. Well, you also have to be honest on your taxes, you have to be honest on your quizzes, right? And all of these kinds of scenarios across your life that are relevant to the virtue, right? So that they have this global character to them, global over the course of your life. So if you're only acting patiently in the context of your sport, and it doesn't touch on anything outside of sport, well then that's not a virtue, right? It has to be something that has this sort of persistence. Otherwise, we have enough counterexamples that I would say, well, you're just not actually a patient person. You just have this kind of either local virtue, I would use that language, like something that's specific within that context, or even a structural virtue, because I don't know what your motivation is in that case, and then you don't have it in the rest of your life. What's really interesting is, so I started this project, when I started this project, I was looking at the ancients. The ancients often employed athletics alongside poetry as a means of forming your character. And they didn't question the fact that these virtues were going to, right, so say I'm forming you in justice through this kind of exercise you do as a youth, it's going to inform the rest of your life. And the reason why it translated so easily into the rest of their life is they were guardians, they were doing military, right? And so if you think about sports practice and military, there's it's a very similar situation, so it's going to cross over very readily. And in sports today, it's not a foregone conclusion that if you are perseverant while you're running, you will also be perseverant in the rest of your life. And so, two things I'll say about that. One, don't think of sports as like the end of the virtue developmental story. It's part of it, right? And so then you also have to translate these things into the rest of your life, right? So say I have a running practice where I work on perseverance on a regular basis. I know how to form perseverance. Okay, well, I also can only read for 5 seconds at a time. Well, then I should work with like a sports-like attitude toward my reading, right? Maybe I start small increments and then I build it longer and longer and longer, right? And so I develop perseverance in a different sphere using the tools and kind of like the structures that I had in my athletics, and hopefully that crosses over. I do think there are some virtues that do cross easily from physical spaces into the rest of our lives. Like, I think resilience, for whatever reason, seems to cross over. And I think it's because it involves, it's not like an impulse sort of thing, it's kind of a conscious decision every day to like keep showing up to practice. Also, this bears out in the literature. Jonathan Haidt talks about play-based childhoods. You tend to be more resilient in the workplace and in school and so forth, so it seems to have some sort of crossover. And that is absolutely the right question. So what is it that you're practicing, and how can you do the work of translation into the rest of your life? Do you necessarily know that it will cross over into the rest of your life? Those are important questions to be asking. And then the language that we're applying, well, we kind of speak of virtues and vices in casual ways in all spheres of life, but there's something patient tracking, there's something perseverance tracking that you are practicing, you are habituating the action, which is part of the virtue developmental process.
Hey, your talk is really interesting. I want to know, like, is there anything that happens when like yourself in chat? Like, people with these kind of systems, like, for example, like, I run cross-country track for like 8 years now, and I've never even like heard of this or really ever talked about it. So, like, are there things that like we can do to start looking chat about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, yeah, it's not just in our sports. I would also say, like, in any practice, anything that you regularly do. So say you go to yoga on a regular basis, or say you are regularly cooking, just pay attention to what you're repeatedly doing and where your mind goes. And so if you are, for example, every day you're setting out on a run and your attention is splitting off to who knows where, well, you're practicing a sort of sloth, this kind of frenetic busyness. And so practice staying in place. So it's kind of just becoming aware of what your little deficiencies are. One thing that really helped me as an athlete, right, so I was running professionally and writing a dissertation on virtue development and acquiring this like vocabulary of virtues and vices that really gave me spectacles to see myself. Like in the way that when you acquire grammar in social studies or in math class or something, you can see numbers in a different way, or you can see the world in a different way. Like having a virtue vocabulary, like learning these terms is it's like putting on spectacles so you can better see yourself. So yeah, maybe familiarize yourself with virtue and vice vocabulary, but then also be honest about like, what is my attention doing? Or when my teammate is succeeding, how am I responding to that? Is it with this sort of like, I'm feeling this like negative, like feeling taking over me? Am I acting in negative ways? Or am I celebrating her? Or like responding in other productive ways?
I was going to ask you about Tiger Woods and the fact that he appears to be, or was such a disciplined and honest golfer, and then was so undisciplined and dishonest in his personal life. You started answering that a little bit, so I wonder if I can shift my question a little bit to like moral environments and moral atmospheres within sports, and your thoughts on that, specifically having come from one that seems, at least from my perspective, as a director of sports studies on campus, to be a relatively healthy moral environment in the world of sports that is running, compared to what I would see as being very kind towards football, for instance, which might be a less advantageous moral environment. Can you speak to moral environments at all?
Yeah, so you're talking about the different cultures of different sports. Yeah. I always speak about running specifically because I know that sport, so I know I'm not like caricaturing it because I'm within it. And so I'm sometimes wary of speaking about other sports because I just don't want to get it wrong or be insensitive to it. Like I know that there are a lot of filmmaking features of being in football, for example, right? Like solidarity, you're learning discipline, you're learning to show up every day, you're learning how to like take care of your body through like eating well and resting well so you can perform well. But then I also, when I look at the sport as someone who studies emotion development and virtue, I worry about things like how you're praised for anger or you're praised for, like there's just more attention on football, and I think with that, like having more eyes on you, there's kind of a culture of bravado here's an example of this. One time I was coaching cross country, and I had just given, I think it was a riveting speech about humility and to my athletes, and really good pep talks when your coach is a moral philosopher. Well, we entered into the locker room areas, and the football team was blasting that song. All we do is win, no matter what. Which is like the most catchy song, and I knew at the moment like I had lost, like that song would stay with them much longer than whatever exegesis I just did on humility. So I think there's like certain vices are present in different sports in different ways. Like I think in running, there's sometimes this sort of rigidity, which is disguised as conscientiousness. You're not very present. There's this kind of like intemperate love of the sport that can develop. And so I don't think it's like one sport is necessarily like cured of all human ills and frailties, and then others are just like pits of vice, right? I think that every sport has its issues, and every sport has good things that are gained, and you just have to become aware of what is the thing in this sport, and how can I mitigate it or address it in practice.
So my question is about running specifically. What is it in both the marathon or ultra-marathon events where you have some of the top athletes who, during the race, they realize they're not in a place where they expect to go in the top 10, not due to injury, they'll pull themselves out of the race. Do you think that is an insight into their character or virtues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the landscape in ultramarathon running is shifting currently, just because there's more money in the sport, and so the way that your contract is structured, you often get a prime for just showing up, but then you get a prime for finishing. And so if you are not going to finish, and like often the way you're finishing is like based on your whatever performance benchmark. So maybe down to top 5, you're going to receive money, but otherwise you're not. And so they're making financial decisions and deciding, well, I received money for being here, and so if I'm not going to perform well, why would I wreck my body? You only get so many 100-milers on your legs over the course of your life, so maybe I'll save myself for the next race down the line and maximize. And so in that case, I just think that the system incentivizes doing that. I don't think it's necessarily a reflection of character. I think if you are a person who, anytime you're feeling like it's not going well, there could be a kind of cowardice of like not wanting, like a poor race to reflect on you. There could be a kind of irresolution where you can't get yourself to see it through to completion. Like I think there are voices if you have a trend of doing this, but when I see a friend like withdraw from a race, usually I'm thinking, I wonder what their contract said specifically, because the incentives are not in place of finishing in those situations.
Thanks again for your talk. It was really insightful. I was just curious. There's a lot of people here that are athletes, and there's really like a larger team. And sometimes the virtues and vices don't always line up with like 50, 60 plus people. I was wondering what would be a good way to almost to try to get people to work towards more of a virtue with a cohesive unit when there's different vices stopping people, or there's different virtues that people are trying to achieve. That makes sense.
Yeah, so everybody who comes into a team, thank you for your question. Everybody who comes into a team has vices, right? And everyone, we all have, a mixed bag of character, right, when we're entering. So there are a few things that I have done in my own coaching to try to get people to finish up really work for virtue. One was pick a really good captain, someone who's going to be a kind of moral buoy, to set like the character and culture of the team. team called people to a higher standard. Like a coach can say, like, I want you guys to be, to have gratitude for the excellences of, the team instead of feeling envious. Well, like coming from a coach, what does that mean? But when it's coming from someone who is on the team, who's a respected member, so having those sort of like using the captain position really well. Another thing is when I say like, okay, our focus is developing a good character. Well, that can mean any number of things. Like, that's kind of like a fool's errand. Where do we start? And so generally my team would have like a virtue and focus for the season, and so maybe it was like we're working on courage or we're working on joy or something we collectively pick it, and as we are going through the season, we are just like in our training logs, we would write down like whatever progress we were making in physical gains, but then also have I made any progress with respect to this virtue. Sometimes like for workouts I would point out like, well, we're doing threshold, and so that the virtues are not big here, so just think about it. But otherwise, like, yeah, it's like a personal accountability that you're reporting on throughout the season. And I think it's really important, like the coach's role here is like increasing accordingly. Like, so if a coach says, I care about your character, but then the rest of the season they're just saying good things when people perform really well or get conference points, it's like, okay, but actually what you care about is performance. And so from the coach's position, having them make sure that they're paying proper attention to it if it's something that they actually care about. And then we would have like MVP, most improved, and then virtue award at the end of the year for someone who did a good job in that respect. So it's something that was a refrain throughout the season. But you try to do too many things is not going to work. And having like a very good captain who has like a character you think is admirable and what you want to stand for is probably the biggest change maker.
We have time for one more question. There are any more questions?
So I was curious, you mentioned in regards to your injury and your experience in PT, the role of resilience and the virtue of recovery as a hopeful act, and like the mental resolve agency to become better. And so I was curious, being at Hope College, Hope in the name, maybe to hear some of your thoughts on the role of hope in an athlete's development or a team's development, and maybe circling back to the earlier question, the difference between perseverance and like a false understanding of ability, and maybe how hope interacts with those two things.
Yeah, great question. So hope is an appetite for our pursuit. That's how Tom McCartney describes it. It's basically like we want something that is difficult and it's far off. So I'll say a couple things about hope. One, if you really want to be resilient, right? Resilient, being able to maintain effective agency in the face of setbacks, being able to continue towards some difficult good. That good thing that you're placing hope in has to be less fragile than your body. So find something that is substantial, that you can root your identity in, that will not disappoint, right? And so for a lot of people, that's going to be some sort of like person connected to their faith, right? Something that is not going to, that's not going to let you down, right? Because you're going to fall in despair, and the thing that you're putting hope in is going to, disappoint at some point. So I'll say that. The other thing that I'll say about hope is that it's a virtue that benefits from community considerably. And so like being able to say you're having like a difficult period or something, having someone around you who's, can carry that burden for you and help you through, I think that's really important. So hopes are often carried by communities. What else did I say? So the connection to perseverance. Yeah, so perseverance, again, right, we're going to talk about, when we're talking about persisting long in some good, you return to the same question. What is the good that you're persisting long to? Is it something that's worth persisting to? Because all of our life is ordered towards something, right? And sometimes when I'm about, like we do book one of thinking and ethics for Aristotle, and it's like, what is, you make a salad, and what is a salad for? Well, it's for writing the course. What are you writing the course for? Strategic A, and to win the war, right? And it's kind of like a series of causes, right? And then I ask them, well, why are you in class, right? And they say something about, oh, attendance grade. Well, why do you need a good grade? You need this for your major. What do you need this major for? Well, you have some vision of what you want to do after school. And then, if you press the question further, what you end at is some vision of the good life. What is it that you're working toward? What are you persevering toward? What is your big hope? And I think sometimes my students when I ask them that question, it's a blank space. Like they don't know what it's working toward. Or they're on just some sort of achievement escalator to nowhere. It's just like, well, this is the next thing I have to achieve, so I can achieve the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. No, you should take the time to reflect on what it is that your life is working toward. Because in the difficult moments, be they athletic, be they academic, be they when you're on the job market trying to figure out what you're going to do next, like if you don't have that thing both to rest in, but also to order your priorities and figure out what your decisions are, what is the grounds that makes your decision a good one, it's going to be a really frustrating, confusing experience.
I want to say as well, one thing that has emerged over the course of this discussion is the way in which having a moral vocabulary can really be beneficial for cultivating virtue in sport, and sort of the impoverished nature of our vocabulary when it comes to different kind of contexts, different sporting contexts. And if you're trying to just have good character, it can be hard to know where to start if you don't have specific ideas of virtues in mind. Dr. Little isn't going to say this because she's a humble person, and she's actually written a book on this topic called The Examined Run. And in that book, she has lots and lots of good examples of specific virtues and how they apply to context of running. So if you're looking for something to read or a place to start when it comes to developing your moral conceptual scheme and vocabulary a little bit, I would recommend her book. So we're out of time, so could you please join me in